1, 2, Freddy's coming for you. A Nightmare on Elm Street completely redefined the sophisticated slasher horror film and is one of the best horror films that's ever been made. And stay tuned to the end since I'll reveal exactly how A Nightmare on Elm Street redefined the slasher horror film. If you're new here, I'm Jordan and welcome back to my channel. I'm a narrative writer, director, and producer and have been working in LA for the last 10 years. This channel is all about filmmaking techniques, the philosophy of art, creative and technical workflows, and what filmmaking can teach us about life. A Nightmare on Elm Street is one of my favorite horror franchises of all time and totally redefined the mid-80s slasher film by adding an intellectual component along with exploring dream logic. In each video in this series, I really want to analyze why writer and director Wes Craven has such a unique directing and writing style and how he totally redefined his own brand of horror. This is the first in a series of videos where I really want to look at some of the earlier scenes within the film and dissect why there's such great ways to open up this film from a structural standpoint. So with that set up, let's dive into the scenes. The opening credits. This is the first images that you ever see in the film, and I really like that the font is very much an 80s style of font that they play as we see what they call a window box or matchboxing, which is really where there's a small square of the frame and it's completely surrounded by black all around it, in contrast to something like a letterbox where there's bars above and below the frame, or a pillar box, which is where the bars are on the left and side of the frame and is more of a portrait standpoint, that it gives it this opening title card feel. It almost looks like a letter that you're almost opening for us to kind of get an intro into the film. So I think this is a smart choice for that reason. So far, I really like that it's setting the mood and the tone so quickly without ever showing the face of who this person is. I'm trying to almost put myself back in a position of if I'm watching this movie for the first time ever and I don't know who the heck this person is with this red sweater. Obviously at this point, now watching it, I've seen the movie before, but I even knew about Freddy long before I had seen it for the first time, even when I was a kid, because he was such an iconic franchise character. So many people had known about before. So in that way, I think when you watch it, you almost in a way know it's Freddy already because of the pop culture influence. But if I'm an audience member in the 80s seeing this for the very first time ever, there is no context of Freddy. It's very interesting to think about that standpoint and go, who the heck is this person? We already know they look like some kind of villain or like something's creepy. We're not showing their face. They look burned on their hands. We see the red sweater, and I really like that already we're introduced to what will become known as the boiler room, which is really Freddy's lair, if you will. As if he's a dragon, then the boiler room is his lair that a dragon would kind of guard or take victims to. So I like that we're already setting up the antagonist. Really, this whole franchise is Freddy's franchise because a lot of the protagonists and other characters come and go throughout the series, but the one consistent factor that always stays is Freddy. So I like that we're already seeing these knives, we're seeing the different pieces of material. It looks very industrial, and even the way it's lit, it just looks like there's flames nearby and flickers, and it gives us this very unsettling feeling. The score comes in right away with the heavy 80s synth, which I think sounds awesome, and the score is such a major part of this movie. So Robert Shaye, who used to be the head of Newline Cinema, he really went to bat for this movie. He found investors when it all fell apart. It's amazing that he was really the reason that this film got made in so many ways. One of my favorite parts about this setup is that what we really see feels so grounded in reality and it feels so practical. We see Freddy literally designing, creating the steak knife gloves that are going to go into his signature glove. We see him sharpening the knives, we see him attaching it to the glove, making sure that mechanically it actually bends. We actually see the knives that he's putting in there. I think it's so amazing that we see how he actually created his own weapon. And again, because his weapon of choice is so much more interesting than just a standard knife that a lot of killers would have, I think it's really important for us to see how it actually came to be and the fact that it was made. It wasn't just suddenly on his hand. It didn't just appear on his hand. He made this in his own boiler room. So it all feels consistent with this industrial feel. And I really like that they show you how this glove came to be. I'm a big fan of when movies show you the intricacies of how something was made or built, especially if it's a prop or a weapon or a location that has a major piece in the story or a piece of wardrobe. I love to see them actually build it and see the inner workings of what materials went into it. So we already get a sense that something is off. We can hear this really creepy breathing. But we are left to fill in all the gaps ourselves, which I think is good visual filmmaking. And because his glove is so unique, I think it's so cool to show us that early, because immediately as an audience, we go, oh, okay, this is a different kind of weapon than we've ever seen before, which already lets us know this will be a unconventional and a unique film in its own right. I really like that we have that signature font where it says Nightmare on Elm Street in white and red. It's just such an iconic font that they use. I wonder if they created that font for this movie in particular. I've never seen that font used in anything else. I also think that very subtle theme they do with the synthesizer of dun 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 will come back around so many times as a leitmotif in this movie. So they bring this in right away, setting the tone early in the film. I'm also a big fan of films that set the tone right away of the visual motifs, the sonic motifs. We already know what kind of ride we're going for right away. And I think that's just the best way to thrust your audience into a story. The opening scene. Right away, we are thrust into a dream from a character we'll come to know as Tina. One of the things I like about this scene is that this is something Wes Craven is really good at, where in the first scene of some of his movies, like this movie and Scream, he introduces us to someone, a female, who oftentimes at the beginning we'll think is the protagonist, but it turns out they're actually not the protagonist. There's somebody who is close to the protagonist, but will get killed, and then we switch over to the protagonist. So I think this is a smart setup because we subvert expectations when we think this is the person we're going to follow. When she ends up getting killed, spoiler alert, we realize, oh, so she's not a protagonist. And then we really start to latch on to Nancy, who we'll come to meet soon. It's a familiar way of opening a horror film where we have this very intense, hectic, chaotic, and violent scene to set the tone of what this movie will look and feel like from a horror standpoint. But it also is a nice way to keep it surprising. One thing I also like is they further explore this leitmotif with the score that comes around so often in this movie. The score is such a major presence throughout every frame of this movie, and I think it's so appropriate because it was made in the 80s. It's the peak of the 80s synthesizer sound and score that you don't really hear as much of in today's scoring world, but I think it's cool. I think it lends a time capsule to that era, but I like that we introduced this theme right away where it goes. Whenever I hear that out in the world, immediately my brain goes to Nightmare on Elm Street. So one thing I think that's really smart about the score that Charles Bernstein crafted, probably with Wes Craven's input, is the fact that this theme is so recognizable, and mainly because it's based off sort of a children's lullaby, the old nursery rhyme of 1, 2, buckle my shoe, which I think was an old English nursery rhyme from like the 13 or 1400s. Feel free to correct me if I'm off on that in the comments below. But one thing I think is smart is taking what is normally a children's comforting lullaby and subverting it to make it the theme of our killer, this horrible child killer in this movie. Children would sing either for fun or to lull themselves to sleep, and now it's really used in this context of signaling when Freddy is nearby. And I'm always a big fan of movies that have a sonic reminder of when the killer is nearby. they either play a certain sound or have a certain score cue come in. So I think Nightmare is a really great example of anytime Freddy is nearby or he's coming for a character, the theme slowly works its way in. And again, it's a way to prime the audience and almost kind of do some psychological effects to make you realize there's danger coming. It gets your heart racing. It puts you on the edge of your seat. The other thing that's really insidious about it when you think about it is usually a lullaby for a child is often sung to help that child go to sleep if it doesn't want to sleep. And in this context, when the children or the teenagers go to sleep, that's when Freddy gets them. So in a way, he's trying to lull them to sleep. So it's easier for him to catch and kill them in the dream since they will die in the real world as well. So one thing that I think Wes Craven makes some really strong choices throughout this whole movie, and we're seeing it with this long corridor with a very bright light at the end of it. It's a very expansive space where this character Tina has really nowhere to go. There's so much open space. She's vulnerable basically. Wes Craven's use of locations, camera angles, and geography to make these characters feel alone, isolated, and like there's a lot of space around them in which they have nowhere to hide, I think is smart. And it just goes to this idea of the dream logic of in the nightmare, space can be utilized, Freddy can manipulate space. Freddy's really in control when they're in the nightmares, so you're not really sure if anything can be believed or not, because we're not always really sure if we're in a nightmare or in the real world. So that line is blurred purposefully so that we always have to question what we're seeing on screen, what's actually real and what's actually not. I just caught that right now, that obviously when you have trouble sleeping, one of the things that usually they tell you to do is to count sheep. We have this boiler room that we don't really know where it is in time and space, but it looks and feels like a real boiler room. I would love to know if they actually just went to a real location and just used a functioning boiler room, because there's steam coming out, there's lights, there's trusses, there's all this piping and tubing. It has this really nice, dark and gritty industrial feel, and it just looks so realistic to me. It doesn't look like a set. So especially because the depth of field is very deep in this film. A lot of the older films have much deeper depths of field where everything in the field of view is visible and not shallow where it blurs out of the background. That's more of a contemporary choice in camera language, but that really means though that you have to production design and fill your frame. One thing that we start to establish here, I just want to point out, is we have this steady cam tracking shot where we're tracking behind Tina, where she's exploring this almost maze-like location of the boiler room. There's a lot of darkness and pockets of light, and it's terrifying because we don't know exactly where Freddy's hiding, but we hear his laugh, we've seen images of his face, we know he's there. So I think Wes Craven is a master at establishing tension with these tracking shots where he follows behind the character as they're walking. And he does this a lot in this film, but he also does this a lot in Scream. And so I think this is something he just does really well. This is kind of one of those signature type of Wes Craven sequences that really feel consistent with Wes's visual grammar. Always has a lot of shots in his movies of characters running away, and we're almost from the killer's point of view, watching the character run, and they look back toward the camera as if we're the killer. Okay, so toward the end of the scene, she's standing in front of a fire pit, and the fire is used to help light the scene. I've always said that I think fire is a really great way to light scenes. I think it looks amazing on actors' faces. It just adds this nice glow, and it's almost diffused in its own right out of the gate. So that when we first have Tina wake up, she shoots toward the camera, which is a little bit of a cliche type of shot. We just see a lot of characters fly up to the camera after they come out of a nightmare. But I think it works here because right on the left of frame, we see a cross on the wall. So one of the things that I like that they establish is this consistent idea and the symbolism of Christianity and the cross, and God will save them from Freddy. So a lot of the characters you'll come to see either have a cross or they rely on the cross to help them, especially when they start to see Freddy in their nightmares.
You okay, Tina?
Just a dream, Mom.
And Lynn's metaphor to the idea of people will grasp at religion, whatever it might be, something beyond themselves, especially when they are terrified or going through a crisis. And many of the characters, this is the thing they lend on, is this cross. I also like that we prolong for quite a bit before we see Freddy's face. We actually really never saw Freddy's full face, just bits and pieces within this first sequence. But I like that so far they still leave a little suspense before they give us the full reveal quite this early in the story.
Some dream, judging from that.
So what's really important here is we establish there are rips in her nightgown, meaning that this nightmare she had where Freddy clawed her in the nightmare, it also translated to the real world. So it really isn't just a nightmare. What happens in the dream also translates to reality. So I think this is where you start to realize nowhere really feels safe. One other thing I think that is important, though subtle, that we set up here is Tina's mom and dad, or presumably the stepdad, this other man who comes in who kind of seems sort of skeezy. It basically sets up that the mom doesn't completely support Tina. She's not the most warm and loving figure, at least established in this scene. She basically says,
Tina, you gotta cut your fingernails, you gotta stop that kind of dreaming. One or the other.
She doesn't kind of rush up to her. She doesn't even approach her. She doesn't really give her the warmest response. And so I think we establish early on that the parent character, at least these two, are not the warmest characters and ones we don't necessarily want to root for, which will consistently be a theme throughout this whole movie. So I definitely think this is the first time we see, in a way, that it's the kids are almost against the parents. And it's also a metaphor for when you're getting older, when you're a teenager going through adolescence, you're coming of age. So often your parents are seen as an antagonist for your growing up. They're telling you what to do. You don't want to listen to them. You think you know better than them. And that part of your life is really where I think oftentimes the most clashing happens with your parents. And so they set up that the parents throughout this aren't going to be, for one, very helpful, but the teens are going to have to really figure this out on their own. The only other thing I want to say about the ending of the scene transitioning into the next is it's a really great transition where, for one, we first hear the full length of the Freddy song with the 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you. They've made it their own version of the lullaby. We have the little girls jumping rope. It looks very dreamy and very brightly lit, and almost as if there's a diffusion filter over the lens. We're back in the real world. We're going about our movie. I think that's just a really great transition just from a visual standpoint. So well done, all involved. One other thing that's pivotal about this, in theory, second scene of our film is this is really where we meet our ensemble. It's really the 4 characters that we're going to follow mostly throughout this film. And we also meet our real protagonist, which is Nancy, played by Heather Langenkamp.
It was the worst nightmare I ever had. You wouldn't believe it. Matter of fact, I had a bad dream last night myself.
What's of note here is this is Johnny Depp's first role ever, first feature role.
So what do you dream? Forget it, Tina. The point is that everyone has a bad dream once in a while.
And we also established that they all had a dream. Some of them are just more willing to admit it than others. So we're now starting to see that this is a collective consciousness dreaming happening. Not just Tina had the dream. They all dreamt about Freddy last night. And this is the first time we tease that, which makes it significant. Also a great choice for, just from a filmmaking standpoint, they use a long lens, which is traditionally anything over about a 50mm lens, and they're far away. And usually when you use a long lens, it really compresses crosses the space this way. And so I like that they have them just walk closer and closer. What that means though is on a long lens, the depth of field is always a little shallower than a wide lens. So what that means is that the camera assistant, typically the first assistant camera or first AC, is having to rack the focus, and it allows the focus to be shifted because as we get closer to our camera with the subject, the sphere of focus is going to change and they're going to come in and out of focus if it's not racked. Back in the 80s when they were making films and they didn't have the wireless technology or wireless follow focus or wireless monitors, that was much more of a science and art back then when you didn't have all of the tech and tools that make this process a little easier. So
These tools for me.
this is where we're meeting Nancy and Glenn. And I think we established that right away. For one, their relationship dynamic is much different than Tina and Rod's. And to me, it definitely seems much more like Glenn and Nancy have a much more wholesome relationship. They really like each other. It's a little more, I guess, innocent, if you will. Both of them were actually teenagers when they shot this, and they look like teenagers. Tina's death. We established Tina in this wide open alley space again. There's nobody around her. This time it's nighttime. And I like that we're seeing the shadow of Freddy. We hear his laugh. There's always usually something that lets us know Freddy is nearby, whether with the lullaby or just his laugh. The other thing I love is these long, elongated, creepy arms that were designed by Jim Doyle, who is the special effects character designer. They're paying off a line that they talked about where Tina is saying she heard this screeching of knives. And I really like how often they play around with practical effects of what Freddy can do. He can change his own body type. He can manipulate a little bit of his own physiology. And that all plays into the dream logic of within the nightmare, the dream, he can do whatever he wants. Anything's possible. And I like that they're supporting this idea with these really interesting and weird practical effects. But I think what it's really supporting is that he has a little bit of this sense of humor to him. He has a little more of a performative nature to the way he tracks his victims instead of being a faceless, silent killer similar to Jason or Michael Myers who says nothing and just kills. So I think this is what separates Freddy apart from the other slasher villains of that era.
Please, God. This is God.
I also like we're still supporting this idea of the teens are turning toward God to save them. So she says, please God, and he says, this is God. So I think he's further just adding that sense of fear of God's not going to save you here, especially when you're in the nightmare. One thing that I appreciate here is the way Freddy runs. You get the sense that Robert Englund, who played Freddy Krueger, is having fun with this role. It's not just a straight run. He's not marching like Michael Myers would do, where it's a very stoic, almost machine-like type of pursuit. Freddy really likes to pursue, makes it weird. He adds his own shifting of his arm. It's just, in a way, it's almost funny, but it's almost more off-putting because often I don't think of a killer acting so almost childlike and having fun while pursuing the prey of somebody they're about to kill. Englund is really having fun with this role, and Craven is really letting him. Some nice teleportation effect where Freddy's over here, which further adds to the dream logic. One of the things I also love about the setup and this idea of Nightmare on Elm Street is that because so much of these films take place in a dream, you really can do whatever you want and it actually works for the audience because it's believable that in a nightmare, logic and reality don't always hold up. So it doesn't have to be as if it would be something that happens in the real world. And I think it's just a really fun and great sandbox that they created that I could see why I created a long franchise. Is there's so many possibilities of what kinds of dreams you can do, what happens in a dream, how this person's dream could be different from this person's. Some really great practical work by Jim Doyle and team of when Freddy slices off his finger and the green starts to pop out. What's interesting here is there's a little bit of a nice use of subjective viewpoint. So this is one of the first times we see Freddy ostensibly in the real world when he's under the covers with Tina, and I interpret this as this is Tina's point of view when we're in this frame. But then when we cut and we see Rod getting out of bed, he takes the sheet off and now it's just Tina in the bed, but she's still wrestling. I see this shot now as being taken from Rod's point of view. Since he is awake, he's not dreaming, he's not experiencing this with Freddy, and yet the repercussions of what happens when Freddy's tormenting someone makes it look like they're just completely losing their mind on their own. And I think that's another part of this that makes it so interesting, is in a way, some of the analysis I read insinuated there could be an interpretation where a lot of what happens in the film is the teen's projections onto Freddy of different anxieties or worries or issues that they're going through, and what we're seeing of the teens has nothing to do with Freddy. It's just them projecting onto a certain character, and it's all happening in real time, their inability to sort of cope with coming of age and those issues. So I'm not sure if I totally agree with that interpretation, but it's certainly an interesting thought experiment to entertain. I'm not gonna lie, that scene is harrowing, especially for an 80s film where sometimes the horror doesn't feel quite as intense or realistic as a horror film in 2024. I think it's a combination of how much blood and the fact that he claws right down her chest and the blood seeps out, which is a great practical effect. But also Amanda Wyss, who plays Tina, has such an incredible scream. I mean, it just disturbs me when I hear the way she's screaming, and it sounds primal, animalistic. There's a desperation, but also a hurt to her scream. You can tell that she's screaming from a place of injury and fear. When she starts floating around the room, I think that's such an incredible visual. Just from a filmmaking standpoint, it's creepy, but it looks great. But I just think it's an incredibly jarring visual that also is pretty iconic and very impressive, especially for a $1.8 million budget at that time. And it's all done practically. I think that's really cool. It makes me feel a visceral emotion, especially with the level of blood they have, and when she falls from the ceiling and we hear and the blood splats on Rod. I've read a little bit of analysis about this too, is that Freddy almost represents this type of sexual predator in a way. And so a lot of the violations he's doing against the teens, especially characters like Tina, are seen as almost sexual violations. And I think part of that you could see too when he slashes her stomach. Some analysis I read said that that was a violation of the woman's body, but also of her ability to reproduce, because that's where you would carry a child. And I think it's also a metaphor in a way for Wes Craven kind of diving into the morality around teen sexuality or lack thereof, especially because that's such a big topic that's explored in a lot of slasher films around that era. Oftentimes in a lot of the other slashers, the teens who have sex and they're not supposed to are punished by getting a very brutal death. So I think there still is very much this dissection of that topic that was such a big part of the slasher horror film culture and dialogue for so long. But one thing I think Nightmare on Elm Street does so well is that a lot of the death scenes feel iconic and they feel like big set pieces. Design of them, the practical effects that happen is still something that holds up today and something that makes the film more memorable, because almost all the major death scenes I can really recall and remember that really stand out and feel like there was much more of a stylistic design to the film rather than a traditional slasher where they just get hacked up, but it's not as eloquent of a sequence, if that makes sense. That concludes part 1 of how Nightmare on Elm Street completely redefined the slasher horror film. I want to hear from you. Comment below your favorite memories of the first time you watched Nightmare on Elm Street, or let me know what your favorite scene is below. For more movie breakdowns, check out more of my videos like this series that I did on The Ring, which you can find here. So check it out. And stay tuned for next week, where we'll continue to break down different scenes from A Nightmare on Elm Street, and I'll continue to make the case as to why it redefined the slasher horror film. So I will definitely see you then.